Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and this is the EVE Universe Show's continued coverage of the CSM 17, this time with Kazanir. How's it going, Kazanir?
Things are good. It's been a jam-packed few weeks, as a matter of fact, so I'm happy to get on here a little late, but wanted to get the word out and talk to the rest of EVE.
Absolutely. It has been a very eventful couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
And obviously, full disclosure, voting has already begun, so, feel free to go out there and vote.
Get out there. Your vote counts.
But Kazanir wanted to make sure that he had the opportunity to come and chat with us. So I was inclined to go ahead and let him, Yeah, we had a very short candidacy period this year, so I wasn't able to get nearly as many people as we wanted to. So here we are, and hopefully, people will watch this and let them, get some value out of it. But I'm very interested in this conversation. I didn't really know you before we started chatting, but even just in the little bit that we chatted before this, I am incredibly excited by this interview, and thank you for coming in. So,
Yeah, you're welcome. That's scary to have to follow now with an introduction like that, but I'm excited as well, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really interesting about this is that a lot of the times, especially in like years past, there have been people who were, for lack of better words, too good to talk to me. Right? There were candidates who knew that they were going to get in, didn't need to bother to sit down with me for an hour, and I wasn't really offended by that. And from my understanding, you should be one of those people. You are, full disclosure, the top of the Imperium ticket. So
yes, vote as the state vote exactly as the state tells you. Exercise your freedom, right? I am at the top of the ticket, and that has impacted my schedule over the past couple weeks. As a matter of fact, that's a big part of why I'm late to this part of the process, right? And also didn't want to steal the limelight, but I did want to get the word out to the rest of the player base of where the Imperium often keeps to itself. But this is a little bigger than that. We feel like the state of things is a little bit dire, and we also feel like there's some space in the metagame to be listened to in a way that I feel like if I had come on this show a year ago with the metagame as it was then and said what I want to say, there was no chance of that happening then. And we think hopefully people have a little more open mind. Right.
A lot of things have changed in the last year, but
indeed they have.
My point is that with you being on the top of the ballot, you being elected is we're going to go with pretty likely.
Right, if we understand the math right, and our turnout is good, right? Of course, we're juicing turnout, but yeah,
it'd be pretty surprising if you weren't. But that being said, let's get to know our future CSM person. He wants to sit down and talk with us. That's awesome. I really appreciate it. And spoiler alert, I was a little bit surprised by some of his answers. But you know what? Enough preamble. Let's go ahead and jump into this. You joined in 2010, which I found really interesting because that was about when I joined. Why don't you talk about why you joined and what happened?
Yeah, great. So I came to EVE. I had recently retired from, I dropped out of college to play semi-professional World of Warcraft, essentially was super big into that game, and then after going and getting a real job, a bunch of my sort of WoW refugee friends ended up playing EVE Online, and I went to play with them, and we didn't know what we were doing at all. I think the first fleet I ever took out immediately got shut up. I decided I wasn't any good at that, but we knew the Something Awful people from the forums, right? The WoW people I knew had been from Something Awful originally, and so we went and joined up with Goonswarm. What I did not know at that time was that Goonswarm owned 2 star systems. At that, right in the middle of 2010, they were crashing on the couch of TCF up with the Northern Coalition, so we got in on the ground floor, so to speak, right?
Yeah, this was like the low point.
Yeah,
for Goonswarm. This was like the transition from Darius to Mittani, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. We may have well been the first corporation to join the Alliance after Mittens took over. Just serendipitously, we had no idea what was going on. For Pete's sake, I sent an Eve mail. I can't, and it worked. Right? They listened. They knew who we were. They looked, So, but yeah, we got in, and of course, like I said, I didn't know what I was doing. So what occurred was that all my corporation members just integrated directly into the Alliance. Goonswarm was good at that, and I ended up an Alliance director and ended up on the finance team doing spreadsheets and all sorts of stuff for Goonswarm. I think one of my first projects was really the founding of what we call space communism today, of the reimbursement program, standardizing SRP. But my part of that was going and gifting every member of Goon Swarm a maelstrom as we were introducing a new fleet doctrine. And at the time, it was revolutionary, right?
Right.
And I remember just being flabbergasted by Mitani talking about it back then, saying I wanted to do this forever. We're just going to pay for everyone's ships. We had accumulated enough Technetium moons to pull that off by late in 2010. And so it was a big metagame change. And that's when I realized that EVE is actually not, it is a ship combat game and a space game and a spreadsheet game, but it is also a metagame, right? And you could be playing the game by changing how you are playing it in really interesting ways. And that's kept me around for a long time. So
yeah, so just to put this into context, wealth in EVE and wealth gain in EVE was significantly different back in 2010. The idea of like SRPs were definitely not necessarily the norm, or if they were kind of, touch and go sometimes. The idea of Titan caches were absolutely unheard of. There were still nullsec holding sovereignty groups that were struggling to pull together enough money to build their first Titan, right? Like that's the kind of world that we lived in at that point. Okay. Yep. So from there, you've been part of you were part of the CFC, as you call it, which is now the Imperium. Yep. And then, sorry. Go.
Gone by 2015, right? That's really where it cuts off. By 2014 or 15, I think we were super involved. If I go through the logs of BTEC R5, the big battle in early 2014, lots of my court members were there talking about how awesome it all was. And then I think, space fired in mid 2015. I was largely inactive by that point. Even the second EVE book records that was sort of a 1.5 to 2 year period of stagnancy, and I had gotten a new job and just moved on, right? A lot of us moved on. A few of us stuck around. I think one of the members of my corporation, K Keller, is in the book as part of the war, and as a name known to people. But yeah, a lot of us had quit, and so I just wasn't involved in EVE. Essentially, I missed what we call the Casino War, what everyone else calls World War B. I was gone by that point, so I didn't get any of that or any of the period after that, and ended up coming back to play in late 2020 during the more recent Giant War. Right.
So that's really interesting because like a lot changed during that time, and
several times.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because like a lot changed, but then I would argue that a lot of the things that we've seen in Scarcity has almost been like a reaction to or a correction for a lot of the stuff that happened in like Citadels and during the Seagull Era. So you missed, it's like you missed that entire block, right? So, which I find very interesting because a lot of the modern people don't have as much of a sense of context for what normal is because normal changed so dramatically during that time.
Right, and that it has been fascinating, and it's so interesting to talk to people who started or started seriously, let's say in 2016 or 17, right? Because to me, like just a skill injector is a background thing to me, right? My characters are established. I can use one skill injector maybe to fill in a gap or something, but there are people out there who that might be half their skill points or something from that era, and it's just crazy. I think I saw the first graphs of the Delve time unit. I said something to the effect of, well, no wonder they're all so mad at us, right? So, obviously there's a lot to talk about in there. So.
Yeah. So I want to go back and ask a couple questions based on your story. Yeah. First of all, what do you mean by semi-professionally World of Warcraft player?
I mean, I was paying some of the bills, right? I was still doing like math tutoring. I was a dropout college student, but I was writing strategy guides. So if the name BossKillers.com means anything, I was doing some Boss Killers in Wrath of the Lich King, as a matter of fact.
Hell yeah!
So if you recognize my voice from those videos, it was pre-YouTube, right? I'm not much of a public profile guy, and never my face was on there. That wasn't my jam. Of course, YouTube existed, but it wasn't like it is today, and so I never made the jump to like this is a streaming type career where this is my jam, right? I went and worked for my parents instead and joined the real world. So
absolutely fascinating. Okay, so but what led you to peter out after BTEC-R?
I mean, since I was very into it the early years, 2010, 11, 12, 13. By the time 2013, 14 rolled around, I was already sort of in senior leadership and helping with spreadsheets and writing apps, and was already fading out. Right. I think I don't actually know. I think I might be on one pilot on BTEC R5, but as I recall, I might not be. I was at work the majority of the day. Right. So I was already sort of done. I had retired from the jump rating business in late 2013, so I held on, but in a declining capacity. Right. But that was
Right. And you're right. I mean, like, BTEC R really did shock the consciousness of like most of the Eve like metagame.
Yeah.
Up until that point, there was a bit of a balance of power where it was believed that N3 and PL had the superior capital, super capital fleet, and Goon Swarm, Imperium, CFC, whoever they were called at that point, had the superior numbers and thus superior subcapital fleet. However, BTEC R proved, it was the moment in which it was proved that the Imperium also had a superior capital fleet, especially after BTEC R, once their cash was locked out.
Yeah, I mean, of course, after the situation changes, I mean, the thing to remember is that we were in league with the majority of the Russians who were quite strong still, right? It was not just CFC. The term Blue Donut actually was invented for CFC Russ together because we had so much of the map once we were together for what the Halloween War that then led into BTEC R5, right? The appellation was originally conceived for that. But that melted very quickly, actually, after BTEC R5, but even though the metagame did not, right? You ask ProGod Legend, he'll tell you all about it, about how they won that war. And the reason that happened is because as soon as we left, the Rust coalition started to essentially fall apart, and they took some of that space back and got the station and all that stuff.
Right.
So in some of their heads, they were really victorious there.
Sure.
So yeah, interesting how that did it changed the metagame, right? And there was this period of like stagnancy for a year and a half, almost 2 years.
There's what I call the paper tiger, right? Like everybody just knew that the Imperium had the superior force, so nobody wanted to mess with them, and therefore the Imperium were able to just grow and expand and become incredibly bloated during that time period because there was nobody threatening them, because nobody thought that they could threaten them.
Right, and that turned out, I mean, after the combination of jump fatigue and then Aegis Sub, that turned out immediately not to be true. Right. As the Empire started to fall apart, alliances left, space got conquered, we started losing, battles to random low-sec people, and getting baited, and that was really the blood in the water that drew the anti-us coalition together. As I understand it, I've been catching up because I missed that time also.
Right.
The Casino War is lore to me rather than I lived it. I had to go fetch my capitals out of Declan years later.
The other problem is that the true story of that war depends on who you ask. But
yeah, of course.
Okay, so gone by World War B1 / Casino War. When did you come back?
So I technically, I mentioned this on the preview. I learned to Boson Rat in mid 2019. I only played for maybe a couple weeks. But really, I came back in late 2020 during the war. Pappy had just dropped one or more of the Keep Stars in Delve, so somewhere between the first and the actual successful Keep Star drop is when I really reactivated and started coming back to play, and got back right to my old job helping with the finance team. It turned out that a couple of my previous compatriots had won Eve also in the interim, so there was a lot to do, and that rolled right up to the M2 TAC thing, which we'll probably talk about. So yeah,
this is one of the things that we don't really talk about a lot, which is that there was a lot of older Imperium members that came back during that time because of the Horn of Gundor, right?
Right. Yeah.
Do you know how many of those people remained past the war?
No, not. I can't give you a number.
I mean, not a number, but like a lot, not a lot, just like vague term.
It feels like a lot,
okay.
Because I recognize their names more than I recognize the new people's names that I don't know, right? Like, even though, I mean, like, there's just huge numbers of people in Karma Fleet I've never heard of, whereas a guy who played even for a couple years in 2010 or 2011, I'm gonna, I know you, right? Even if they didn't play that long and just came back. So it feels like a lot. At the same time, we can all see the PCU that applies to us as much as anybody. It's not like a ton of people are logging in relative to a year ago. I think that's pretty widespread. So it's hard to say.
So you were the Herald of Scarcity.
I don't know if I like that title very much. Yeah, I mean, came back right in the middle of it, right, and then was really interested to see how they can continue to pursue that into the industry changes that have had such dramatic effects. But yeah, things were interesting, and we had to take extreme measures, and decided to. Right, we looked at the political situation primarily, and I think really it was within those Keepstar kills that the Imperium collectively all decided together that we were going to put up everything we had and not lose to these guys. And it was worth losing, right? And that was sort of an evolving cultural decision as we threw a lot of stuff at those Keepstars to get them down, right? And that maybe might not have been worth it in raw numerical terms, right? But in morale terms, it was totally worth it. And so at that point, once we had all decided and it felt like everyone was on board, and that's the sort of thing that really is organic, right? Of course, we have the Space Emperor, right? But getting everyone on board to really commit like that is a little different. But that's what emerged out of that period of the war, was that level of commitment. And so at that point, it made it easy to solve financial problems later down the line.
Yeah, what I like to remind people about, like, our faction warfare group, they're like, oh, they're not providing money or whatever. I'm like, that's the reason why we make money, right? Like, right. It's okay to lose money if you're winning the objective. That's why you have money.
But, yeah, I mean, we are. I think this is I gotta say, this is a strength of Goon Swarms relative to our historical enemies, is that we don't care about stuff like a battle report if it means we're going to win the objective, right? We spent a phenomenal amount of money on that war, and we'd spend it all again. Right, it was completely worth it to be like, no, this is not going to happen. We're not going to let you blow up the whole universe and act this way. And I think it was worth it to send that sort of signal, and I'm glad we did so.
Do you think that CCP made good decisions in their changes during scarcity overall?
I mean, I gotta say no, right? That with a caveat that there are many pieces of the picture that are sound here, right? And that was part of what informed our approach last year when the industry changes came down, and the tack we took. I tried to be positive. In part, that is because I could see many positive pieces of the puzzle. When I did talk to a CCP person at that time, he asked what I thought, and I said, I think the jury is still out, and a great deal depends on what CCP does next. And I felt like there could have been things they could have done next that would have changed how things gone, and then they didn't, essentially. So I think there have been a lot of mistakes made, even though I see some positive changes or things that need to be done. And I don't want that to sound like I'm saying, oh, we shouldn't have changed work walls or whatever the previous mechanics were. Obviously, the graphs I've seen are extremely broken. But how to deal with that, I think, should have been lots different. And I think the game's overall understanding of the meta and what happened exactly with Rourke Walls is sort of busted.
Right. And we'll circle back on some of those details in a little bit, I think. Yeah. But is this your first time running for CSM?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is the part that gets me. Okay, Merkel-chan has been, like, the Imperium person for the last several years. Yeah. And him and others were term limited out of this election, which is one of the reasons why the field is so open this year.
Indeed, yeah, it feels that way.
I would have expected one of the people that, like, ran last year trying to, like, get a secondary place within the ticket to have been, chosen and elevated up by the Imperium's, bestowal
some guy
of
you've
power.
Never heard of.
Yeah, and yet I get a guy that I never heard of. So why are you running for the CSM, and why were you chosen by the Imperium to be the guy?
Well, I wish I could answer that and not feel afraid of the answer, right? And I think that's what I wrote in the why here, right? Is that I think the reason that Goon Swarm is putting me on here is because I have a high level of trust with them, right? They trust me to manipulate trillions of ISK to replace 100 Titans in a weekend when that's necessary, and so that's the sort of person we try to send in general, like, and that applies to the candidates we've sent before, right? So that really is the big thing, and also there's this element of I am Goon Swarm's good guy internally. Right. That may sound shocking, but they do exist, right? And we feel like we're at a place where we can sort of try and be the good guys. Goonswarm has never sort of locked itself into one thing or the other. I've always felt like we're the game's anti-hero, right? At times they can be overthrowing the evil empire. At times they can be becoming the evil empire ourselves, right? The anti-hero, we're flexible, right? But I think now is the time where we have to say, look, the game is clearly not doing great. Something has to change. Many things were changed. They appear to have not worked out or only partially worked. What has to happen here? And we're at the center of it. Like you say, the metagame changes. The Rorqual era sort of poisoned everyone's minds for better or for worse, and I'd like to find some way to unwind that, if at all possible. Because what I'm looking at in all the indicators is a depression, right? And that's a serious word, right? Serious people use that word to mean serious things in real life. But when I look at Eve's charts and I see that half of the economy is gone, that's scary, right? It should be scary. And so I feel, I said this to you earlier, I feel a kinship with the story of Daniel, both going into the Lion's Den in terms of trying to talk to non-Imperium people, but also coming back to the game and seeing the writing on the wall, right? And seeing that it has a half or a third of the players it used to it and wondering what happened, so...
Should we be concerned that the person that's manipulating a ton of the Imperium's money is going to be under NDA? If I remember correctly, we had some interesting issues with that in the past.
I mean, you should be concerned, right? At the same time, I gotta say, I have watched the behavior of our hostiles, on the CSM over the past couple of years, and those are the guys you should be more afraid of, right?
I'm not sure if that answer makes me more comfortable.
I know. But I mean, really, I was not impressed, right? I listened to a number of like hostile firesides or town halls where we saw a couple of these cats who have also now been rotated off by term limits, openly taking credit for stuff in the scarcity package that ultimately just didn't make players happy, and doing it because they thought that it was going to advantage them in the war, right? Of course, everyone perceived crabbing and prosperity and wealth and all this stuff as a pro-goon thing, and so they thought that anything they could do to change that would be to their advantage and push for it very openly, right? And stuff that doesn't always come out in public. Of course, some of this is hostile town halls. I have spies. I'm listening to it, right? But that informs my thinking on the matter. I guess the second answer is that we just have to talk about it, right? This is the CSM. We should be able to talk about game mechanics in a way that is not partisan, right? The EVE player base is bitter and partisan at the best of times. I know that. That's part of our problem, right? Is that people do this all the time, and that's exactly what I would like to unwind somehow, because there really isn't any alternative. The alternative is the writing on the wall, and I don't want that, right? And that's where Goonswarm is also, right? When I went and talked to people, everyone is comfortable with people other than us getting buffs, because we know they need buffs to come fight us again, right? We want another war a few years in the future, or a few years after that, but we want it to be with 20 or 30,000 new players who have come to EVE from whatever other games there are for the next decade, right? Where they quit and say, oh, I want to play this spaceship game. But there have to be mechanics to promote that.
Right. Would you say that, I guess the reason why I said that makes me, it doesn't comfort me at all, is like the idea of like, well, they're doing it a lot. Sounds to me like justification to do it.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I don't think we'd get away with that. We've never thought we could get away with that, right? Okay. Because it's pretty obvious, and we get a lot of focus, right? Whereas you have someone like Gobbins who opens up a Dread stimulus program 2 weeks before the industry patch changes are announced, and that just goes unremarked. He's never been called out on that. He got called out on like the Edencom thing, which is way stupider and less impactful, right? But like, just a couple weeks before the capital change blog drops, that knowledge that it's going to happen in the first place, Horde all of a sudden has a Dread, like get into your first Dread program. That sort of stuff. I mean, they're
trying, super sus,
right? Yeah, it's very sus, right? Sure. I think the thing to do, and this is, we'll get into more details of this, but I think the thing to do is make sure that you're building game mechanics that have tension. You should not ever have something where you're coming in and saying, well, this is out of whack and we're going to nerf this, and this, or buff just this, and this, in a way that it's easy to take advantage of, right? If you're introducing new mechanics, you always want to have there be some tension where even if one group of players is trying to take advantage of a thing, and even if they might have inside knowledge, there's going to be some other group competing that can stop them, right? Rather than it just being, oh, I know this is going to happen, so let me invest in this thing. CCP is worried about that. I think the changes we need are sort of broader even than that, than worrying about at that level, honestly, right?
Right. So the Imperium are sending several candidates up. One of the more well-known ones at this point
Sure.
is Angry Mustache,
Yeah,
who
great
really
guy.
is dealing with a lot of the same stuff about like the economy
Yeah.
and about understanding how to fix things and all that stuff. Why do you feel that you are essential to be on the CSM as the top ticket as opposed to one of these other people?
Well, I don't necessarily. Don't let me come out and say that, right? I am honored that the Imperium is willing to put me on the top of the ticket. That's shocking, right? And I wrote some about that. That's why I wrote my thread the way I did, is I realized I just should tell the truth and not lie. And the reality is that a lot of goons are worried, right? And they're willing to send someone who is not a jackass publicly, so to speak, and who might be willing to talk about stuff that is not in our favor, right? We all know that there's going to have to be buffs to other playstyles, right? And have never not been in favor of that. So that, I think that's a big part of it, right? Angry has done a great job with all the spreadsheet stuff. I am terrible at that level of like effort and commitment. So I'm really glad to have him on the team. I hope to try and talk about like larger metagame stuff and hopefully bring a historical perspective, like we were talking about, right? The game hasn't always been this way, either the way it is now, the way it was during Lifeblood, the way it was during Dominion. It's changed many times, and I think trying to understand that stuff can help us out here.
Right. And I'm sorry for drilling into this so much. It's just, it's
You're
so
okay.
cute. Like, this is, I don't often get to interact with people like on this level. And so, I'm very interested in how this process goes. Did it start with you saying that you wanted to run for the CSM and then like them accepting you as the top ticket, or did you get approached and get told that, you'd be useful in the CSM? Like, how did that process come together?
Technically, part of the story is classified.
Fair enough.
But so technically what happened was I was ranting in a relatively private channel extensively about whatever, I don't remember when, around the time of the Feldistry changes, or maybe even prior. I
Did you
can't
say the
remember the exact.
Feldistry changes?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Sorry. They didn't give it a real name of the patch, and so it sort of happened that people call it that. They just call it the industry patch. The blueprint changes.
Yeah. I
In
never
any
heard
case,
that term.
right, yeah. In any case, I was ranting about it and a variety of game mechanical things and metagame power curves and other MMOs. And someone was like, it might have been Noms, in fact, who said, yeah, I should have sent you instead of me this year, right? Because he was feeling a little fed up on that particular day. And so things sort of just evolved from there, right? Angry's on my team, and in theory, you could sort of say he works for me. That's not really official. There's a guy who outranks us, as a matter of fact, who's largely retired on the finance team. So that sort of is how that it started to evolve that way, and we saw that there weren't, like I said, when I talked to CCP about it briefly and then did not go on the show that Kenneth went on a year ago, what I said was I think the jury is out, right? I saw a path where things could have gone great, and none of that happened, essentially. So,
Feldistry. Okay, I get it now. I thought you said fail, like as in it failed, but Feld as in FELD. Thank you for the clarification, chat.
Yeah, sorry. I gotta say, fail would be equally accurate. I was not expecting. I was not expecting to open a FanFest presentation and have them show off a chart, and on that chart is showing the number of capitals built from 2016 to or 2015 to 2022, and to have that show, I guess, on the left side, 0 capitals other than freighters being built for a year, and to also have them think that chart is about Rorquals. They surprise me every year. Let's put it that way.
I don't know if they said that the chart wasn't about roque walls. The period of time was referred to as the reign of the roque walls because all of
Sure.
those other things were the secondary effects of there being roque walls in existence.
Yeah.
Or like the roque wall buff.
I guess what I mean is that CCP was putting up that chart in order to talk about it and say, oh, look, the roque wall period, it was very bad, right? Even though I look at it and the zero capitals being built for a year is actually much more scary, especially coming on the heels of a sort of proliferation period that's part of the stagnancy, right? And has to do with how the game's power curve evolves.
If the goal is to force people to bleed out the ones that they already have rather than produce new ones, wouldn't that be what you expected and want?
Well, you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, capitals were destroyed during that period and not built.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. I think the effect on player behavior is essentially an order of magnitude larger, right? You're right that in theory, no capitals get built. A few get destroyed, the number will go down, right? That it works. But what we saw immediately, right? And I'll get to why this is why I thought I wouldn't be believed. What we saw immediately is people not using them the way that they would have if they could be more easily replaced, right? The war is the very first example, right? All of a sudden, everyone knows that their super or their Titan can't be replaced. Are you going to put it in another M2 tax situation?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, obviously it would suppress its use too, but my point is that, like, it still gains its effect. Like, it's going to have, obviously its use goes down and therefore the amount of destruction is going down, but if you cut off production, like, you're not going to just get them. Like, CCP could not have made it so that people still consumed and destroyed capitals at a normal rate while not being able to build them. Like, you're not going to get that perfect world. So instead, you cut off capital production, and though they are using them less, they are still using them and then get destroyed. How is this not achieving the goal?
Well, I mean, I think the goal of unwinding the clock, I mean, I think you could try to achieve the goal, but it locks you into the situation we've had for the past year, right? Where because no one can build them, everyone knows that it influences player motivation and there's simply far less activity, right?
Right.
We credit the industry patch with our winning the war. There were several other factors, right? But counterfactually, if we go back to April of 2021, now we imagine that there is no patch. Goon Swarm is still down to 6-star systems at this period in time, right? But now, rather than the whole universe being on our doorstep with 6-star systems and no capitals being built, they can produce a replacement dreadnought fleet every few weeks. Suddenly the war changes, but thanks to CCP, that wasn't possible, right? And so it just sort of is like, it's mind-blowing, right? Because the default assumption is, well, Goons built all these capitals, we're going to nerf capitals, that's going to nerf Goons. Right. And you, again, saw it in the private communications of hostiles, right? There are a couple of guys...
Let me see if I understand this. What you're saying is that when they shut off capital production, they basically locked in the meta, right? The people that had the most capitals had the most capitals. The people that didn't have the most capitals didn't have the most capitals. And that could not change. If they had been able to continue to build capitals, then they could have continued the siege while building more capitals and changed that meta. But they couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. Or by grinding through it, right? You'd have to actually win some fights, right? But yeah.
Right, but they will always be at a underfoot, even though they have the space now. Is the problem? Like, what good is the space if you can't build any Titans there?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. They all still exist, and they'll just never be destroyed at the rate you would need to unwind the clock. You have to come up with some other solution to the Rorqual period was it's a very difficult problem to unwind, right? So they made a bunch of decisions I would not have. And I think if we understand it differently, we might be able to come up with better ones.
So one of the things that what you're talking about brought to mind is the fact that they nerfed the capabilities of these capitals before making them impossible to build. If they had made them impossible to build first, then people wouldn't, like, maybe the fact that people didn't use them was suppressed further by the fact that they also were less defensible. If they had made them, if they had left their capabilities intact and just cut them off, then perhaps they would have burned through the stockpile faster.
At least somewhat, right? It does influence it. And that actually sort of gets it why I didn't want to sort of blow up the world a year ago, because some of these changes did look good, did look like they had a path. When you're in the situation that your game's end game power curve, too many people have reached it, right? And that's the situation that Rorquals brought about, is essentially a huge increase in velocity through the game's power curve, through not just Rorquals, but also skill injectors at the same time, right? Were huge in escalating people through the game's power curve faster. Once you do that and too many people have reached it, then a nerf is actually the right idea, right? Nerfing all the capitals down so that they're not as effective makes a ton of sense. You say, okay, well, a carrier, it doesn't cost 200 billion anymore. You made it cost 800 million. I guess it's easier for that stabber gang to kill a carrier now, right? So that the capital focus part of the surgical strike patch and those changes, and we can talk about Sinos later, but all those related changes, those aren't necessarily bad, right? That's a good way to nerf capital proliferation. But what you can't do is then go make them unbuildable, right? You can't just say, now the power curve is cut off. What you have to do somehow is introduce a new layer of the power curve on top, and don't screw it up, right? Don't screw it up the way you screwed up Rorquals. The existing EVE power curve in 2016 should have lasted the game easily till 2025, maybe 2030, right? And I should have had you bring the graph up of the capital builds. But if you look at the super capital builds, the way it works is it very steadily climbs, and then Rorquals happen and goes and does this, and then in scarcity, before the industry patch changes, it goes back to the low level, really close to where it was, or a little lower than in Aegis, and continues to slowly climb, right? You imagine that slow climb working for like a decade, and you don't run out of players who want to build a Titan for 10 or 15 years. But essentially what happened is EVE ran out of players who want to get through the end game curve, right? And that's a huge part of the missing activity, and there was nothing for them to do. And then all of a sudden it became not worth it for them to try to do things with the end game ships that they already had. And the result is essentially stagnancy, or people quitting, or some combination of both.
Is scarcity over?
No.
What would it take for scarcity to be over?
Well, several things. First, I want to highlight Abyssals, which are like the unsung story of a lot of this, is that Abyssals have raised the floor of what anyone can make safely, right? So that sort of ups the ante for any other type of content, which is not safe, in terms of the amount of money you need to make. And that's a big part of what has happened over the past few years, is that every other type of content is essentially competing with a safe money printer, more or less. Now, you have to be skilled, right? You have to learn how to do it. You have to have the fits. You have to have the ship skills. It's still EVE, right? But it's still, safety is a very competitive mechanic in EVE, right? I'm a jump freighter pilot. I'll tell you, the number of times I'm undocked when I'm not fully safe is very small. Right, it's exactly the same logic applies to how people make their money, right? So that Abyssals raising the floor is part of this. To really end scarcity, you essentially want to give players the ability to generate income more quickly. And this, I can go back to the prosperity buff last winter and talk about this. We focused a lot on the waste changes and on the compression stuff. But the big thing CCP did there was they doubled the amounts of everything in moons, belts, gas clouds, right? That doesn't necessarily make a player richer, as a matter of fact. For a moon, it could. For your money moon, there's a lot more money in the moon now. There's more of the R64s. But what we saw immediately was the prices of all the moon goos start to crash, because there's really not that much more demand for Tech 2 ships, even though they doubled the amount of goo, right? The way to fix it is to allow people to generate more of whatever resources, income, something per minute, so that it's competitive and people will get out there and do it, right? I think the other sort of big thing, which is not about scarcity specifically, but about the value of space more broadly, is that in the changeover to Rorquals, when we switch from essentially harvester moons to extraction to fract moons, a big piece of the metagame was sort of silently lost in terms of how you generate value from your space. It used to be, when you went and conquered space, you had a couple ways of making money that weren't about your crabs at all. first of all, you would tower moons and you would just harvest them, right? You didn't need to mine them.
Right.
And then secondly, you could rent, right? That was an invention of Band of Brothers. They said, we're just going to rent this out and we'll get passive income that way, right? Of course, we hate that, right? Because we don't like that stuff. But those were the two ways. Yeah, well, I was there when we did it for a couple of years, as a matter of fact. I got a mea culpa on that one. I hated it the whole time.
Fair enough.
But it pissed money, right? Those are the two ways of getting value for your space without farming it yourself. So now let's think what happens when we change from harvester to extraction moons. All of a sudden, moons are no longer there. The only way to hold space and get money without farming it yourself is to rent it. And so I think that was actually a big missed metagame change, was that there's no longer a floor. Again, this is going to come up a lot. Moons were the floor to the value of space. Right? If you held the space, you had the moons, you had a floor value, even if you weren't doing anything else. You take that floor away, and now space essentially is worthless unless it's being farmed. Right. That actually wasn't true for the first 15 years of Eve's life. Right? So I'm sure it's going to shock people that a Goon candidate shows up here and talks about passive moons. I hate the word passive, actually. But that's a big metagame change, and I think we see outside the Imperium over the course of 2017 to whatever, that the smaller groups do start to die off because the people who are big and organized enough to rent out space themselves are more successful, right?
Right. The way I would think about it is there used to be value in owning the space. Right, now the value is in using the space alone. There is no value in actually owning the space, which, given the fact that the space costs money to own, probably ends up being a bit awkward. I do want to push back, of course, on your notion that the Abyss is safe. In the last 7 days, over 500 billion ISK was destroyed in the Abyss in PvE alone. And also the Abyss you can get ganked on your way out of the Abyss. I will concede to the fact that the Abyss being able to be ran in Jita is absolutely breaking the game. But outside of that, do we really... I don't like the notion that safety and lack of safety, or more importantly, risk in the risk versus reward calculation, must exclusively relate to the risk that is caused by other players. I think that significantly limits the design space of the PvE.
No, and I don't want to limit the design space. And I know CCP is big on this also from some conversations we've had. Of course, the Abyssal content can be super engaging. I actually just recruited a friend of mine from the WoW days. The guy before I had Goonswarm, this is the guy I used to pay to hit things for me in raids, right? A DPS warrior. And we ran some Abyssals. I had never done them before, but it's great content to learn and talk through, hear all the different pieces of Eve. I think that's awesome. But it's exactly like you say, the Jita thing is the biggest thing.
Got it.
Right? If it were all of a sudden I have to, in order to run the top level one, I at least have to be in low sec, that's a huge change, right?
I've suggested 0.5.
Yeah, something like that.
That way it's like moon mining, because you can only moon mining in 0.5.
At least.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, totally.
Or, I mean, I've never even played a Dark Souls game, but can you imagine the idea of an Abyssal with a room that you might cross some other person's Abyssal, and it's just like an intersection, and you don't know if they're going to show up. You don't know even if the room is shared until you get there, right?
That's a good fucking idea, actually.
They haven't even explored any of these mechanics, right? And that's but yeah, the Jita thing is the big thing. It's the total safety of the, relative to other content, right, is the big thing. So
they did kind of explore this in the fact that the original proving conduits were a final conduit, like a final gate at the very end. And so plenty of people would accidentally go through the proving gate and end up in a proving conduit, not knowing it. Okay. But I do really love I hate the idea of high tier Abyssals being moved out of high sec all told, because people wouldn't run them then. We want people to run them, right?
Yeah.
We want people to run them and then have that still be risky. So this idea that also in T5, T6, occasionally you get the, just like you occasionally get the shipyard room, occasionally you get a room with another player in it. And who the fuck knows what happens? You could work with them against the enemy, or you could kill the other player and take their stuff. I think that would actually be an interesting way of looking at it, more than just, simply saying that it needs to be in a more in a space where I can gank you more.
Oh yeah. No, that the very simple idea that players always have of just take it out of high sec is actually not good. I hate those type of ideas as well. They should do something better. This is actually the Wizelior, the CFO of Goonswarm, and I were talking, and he mentioned to me that it is always better when CCP comes up with a new thing that players have to solve, rather than just trying to nerf the old thing or change it or whatever. It's always better where there's some new toys in the sandbox for people to figure out how they fit together. Right.
Right. Yeah, and it said in chat, like, there needs to be a way to escape the situation. Just make it like the shipyard room, right? The gate is already open. Run if you need. Run if you can.
Oh yeah. Exactly. No, I mean it could be. I mean, there's so many. I don't want to like list out game design ideas because that's not really my candidacy shtick either. Right?
Sure.
But there's so much they could explore. Right.
Okay. Well, but let's bring this back to base, I guess.
Sure.
Help me understand why this makes it so that scarcity isn't over.
I mean, essentially what the industry patch is probably the biggest thing that's happening. Without the demand for capitals, all of the stuff that went into capitals, there's not any demand for, so there's not as many people buying it. Therefore, it's not worth as much, and therefore there won't be as many people producing it.
Hasn't that changed recently?
Not really. So if you go look at just the MER today, and go look at the IS graph of the bounties in nullsec, and when the ESS change was introduced, ESS was immediately a 60% nerf to the money that nullsec was making, right? That hasn't recovered. It's a little higher now, but what has recovered is components, right? You look at commodities, sorry. You look at the blue loot graph of Wormhole and Abyssals combined, that's tracking up pretty solidly, right? So, I mean, there's that.
So is your definition of scarcity the capability of money making in nullsec versus other spaces?
No, I mean, they've done a lot of stuff. Scarcity it hit Ore, it hit nullsec pretty hard with the ESS thing. I think the industry changes factor into it, but there have been a lot of other sort of changes that also have hit. Trade is a great one. They both removed margin trading and added taxes to player citadels that weren't there before, where now you're paying half of your broker's fees out to CCP as well, right?
And they made it so you can't 0.01 ISK.
Right, yeah. That I don't care about that. That's not that big of a deal.
Fair enough.
But I guess that can be complicated, right? It might be that it's tuned too harshly right now, or that you need a better way to have skills impacted. I'm not sure. That does affect things, but I think the margin trading was a big one because it means people need to front a lot more ISK in order to participate as a large scale, someone who drives the trade economy, right? Before, you could be getting away with a lot less. You could have big buys up. They'd last a long time. Now, it just doesn't work. So there's that. The tax thing is another thing, right? The amount of money that player economies are now sending to CCP that they weren't before, that has to go back and interact with JITA is a substantial thing. So there's lots of different stuff. I think the ESS and DBS together are the ones that feel like they're choking off nullsec in particular, because everyone lives there, you're always there, you always have the 54% blinking at you or whatever, and it never changes because the system is totally broken. But I think there's lots of stuff, across all of these different things. And really, like, talking about scarcity, actually, I think sort of not misses the point, but it's missing the other half of the story, is what should have happened to fix this stuff, and what is the way to unwind your power curve breaking in this way, and what should they be doing with it, right?
Right, and I guess that was the question that I had, which is like, okay, well, if this is not good enough, what do we do now that would make your answer turn from no to yes? Like, well,
I think,
should it go from no to yes?
I mean, I think it needs to, but I'm not saying to bring back work walls, right? We view this in the broad metagame terms, work walls and injectors and and supercarrier ratting, which doesn't get mentioned in the same breath often enough, but all that prosperity together advance people through the power curve much faster than originally was designed, right? Eve's original design didn't even have Titans, but once expanded, it should have lasted us a long time, and we just essentially burned through it way too fast to the point where now both or multiple groups have 1,000 Titans and everybody's done, right? So and then to fix that, they made it difficult for people to make money, essentially. What you don't want is something where someone can break the game the way Rorquals did. But you do want a power curve in terms of the amount of money you can make. You don't want it to be it's just tier 6 Abyssals and Jita. You want there to be some scaling, right? Again, risk versus reward is important, but there isn't a high end to that anymore, right? It used to be that there was some risk versus reward. You could put your super carrier on the field, you could be making more money, right? But with the variety of changes, in particular the ESS stuff, that's just not true anymore. So I think it's a broad sort of range of things, if that makes sense.
Do you think that it would be better to just simply like put anomalies back to the way they were, so that way people were super ratting in anomalies again? Or do you think that it would be better to produce like more engaging content in nullsec that requires more attention and more thought and more skill than anomalies do now, but then would give more rewards? Which one?
Yeah.
Should it be dead simple, or do we need good PvE?
I think we need at least somewhat better PvE, right? I think the big mechanical idea that CCP has been missing in here, and this might be their new dev blog. I haven't reread it enough to say for sure, but the reason that good PvE is important is because it lets you manipulate your content more dynamically than ship balance changes. Right. In many games, PvE's balanced first, and then PvP's tacked on. It's the opposite here. It should be, right. The way you balance your PvE is by putting mechanics into sites that balance it, right, rather than having it just be strictly about the ship balance. And that can be much broader based than people have ever thought of, right. Something that comes up a lot that qualifies as a big idea is getting sites to tackle people more. Right. But you don't need to make that about the ships or the rats even necessarily. That could be mechanics that players choose to engage with within the site, and those are things that CCP can change a lot more easily than they can change a module, right, potentially.
Right. So, I like to tell people that, when people say that CCP needs to provide content drivers, I say, well, CCP is the E in PvE, so that's what they can work on. You know what I mean? Like, that's what they can do. And I think that... for instance, the events system that we've been seeing, where a lot of the events have been being put into lowsec and have rats that are far more engaging and do things like scram, has been successful at both providing incredibly lucrative ways of making money, which has drawn people out there and gotten people to be in environments that were blended PvP and PvE seamlessly. The problem is that every time that these kinds of things have been introduced or even suggested towards nullsec people get extremely upset. They want control. They want stability. They want simple solutions that they can execute. They don't want, non-consensual PvE or whatever. They don't want to have to deal with extra bullshit. How do we make a system of PvE that nullsec people will be happy that they have to do?
I think the non-consensual point is important. Of course, the drifter thing was a big thing where, nullsec players hated that. We don't want NPCs attacking our crap just because that's not fun, right? But I can imagine some situations where that is not true, and you would have sort of NPC engagement that CCP is making that ends up in a conflict situation, right? I can imagine a scenario where instead of, like, again, idea time for a second. Imagine for a second that instead of holding your space and farming it yourself, you're renting it to some NPCs, right? A pirate faction. And now you have blue triangle rats show up, right? Or and they're blue to you, but so now you don't want to crab there. If someone else crabs there, they're not going to pay you as much rent, right? So it's all of a sudden a different sort of PvE scenario where you don't want the site to be run. Someone else is going to try and run it, and you are trying to go shoot them. Right, that's a different sort of thing where there is, it's not the same as like the drifter scenario where you have, NPCs attacking players that never engaged in it. It's a different sort of thing where one player has said, I don't want to be crabbing, but maybe there could be NPCs involved anyway. Those sort of ideas, I think, have a lot of potential to explore actually without getting into what you're saying NPC or nullsec players rightly freak out about often, right?
Yeah.
I think there's some field to play around here.
One of the things I do remember hearing a lot during the drifter attacks was not just the fact that it was extra bullshit, but more importantly, that the reward for fighting them was very low too. Like there was a lot of people that felt like if there was a purpose for fighting them, then it would be interesting. But it felt like there was no purpose for fighting them aside from just preventing the AI from reinforcing your structures.
Correct. There was not, right? If there had been, I mean, any sort of defined timelines, rewards, reasoning, right? I mean, this is actually, we continue to be slightly bitter about this because if you look at the number of structures that were sieged, I don't have the numbers to hand, but our Imperium structures were sieged by a factor of something like 3 or 4 to 1, especially big stuff, right? It was like there's one drifter hole or one drifter attack in the whole region, and it's one system away from an Imperium staging keep star in pure blind or whatever it was, right? I don't know how that happened exactly, how that went down. I'm sure that, I'm not saying there was malice necessarily, right? I can imagine lots of ways where that's not malicious. We really dealt with a lot out of proportion to the rest of the game, so there's some heartburn about this, yes.
Right. Okay. Nominate in chat just handed me a chart showing
he has the links.
3 times as much attacks against Imperium forces as against any of the other groups.
Yeah, it was bad. I don't know if we've ever published this before, but it's been familiar internal lore, especially to leadership, for some time. We're very wary of these types of mechanics.
Right.
But that's all to say, I think there is room to play around with this without stepping over some bright lines.
Right. So conspiracies aside, so are you suggesting that the key to scarcity is just giving people better things to do in nullsec?
I mean, nullsec and everywhere else. I have high hopes for lowsec too. Some of that.
Sure, yeah, but I mean, like, is it really like when I think of scarcity, and this is the reason why I keep coming back to this argument. I think about the availability of things. Like that's what scarcity means, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think that that's what CCP meant when they ended scarcity by doubling the resources of everything. Now there's stuff there. Go get it.
Yeah,
it's no longer scarce. But
no,
obviously, the player base didn't agree with that.
No.
Right.
No, I mean, so there's several missing things, right? Still, there's multiple Tech 1 ores not available, minerals not available in nullsec.
Right, but that's intended, and that's not supposed. Like,
I know.
Okay,
I know. So I'll let me get there. Though.
Go for it.
So like, asteroid belts are totally missing. Rats are all over on gates. It's harder to farm them. The ESS is always there choking you. So like there are all these sort of things that are still there, right? I understand I was positive about the changes because the industry diversification of capitals I think can have success, right? The idea that a capital should be built of multiple different types of component, that you can't just all farm one thing. I think that's good, right? Or has the potential to be good. But the fact that like, trying to think of a good example. I mean, we've sort of talked about many of them across the course of this question several times. Let me think if I can sum it up better.
If I could make a get or like try to piece together my thoughts on this. When I think of scarcity, or when I've argued this point before, it's about the availability of resources. But what I'm hearing is that it's availability of activity and value.
Yes, some combination. An activity always has to be valuable enough to make it worth engaging in as compared to some other activity, right?
Yeah.
If you ask any miner, they will link you right to a chart of ISK per hour. Now that's sort of BS. It's more complicated than that, right? But sometimes it's not that much more complicated than that, right? And that in the aggregate, statistically, that influences what players do, right? So I think there's a lot of different things, and they have a PR problem. Right, also. They have this PR problem of we did scarcity and people haven't been living in nullsec, and many of the serious moneymakers have ended up like living in a wormhole or doing something else to make money and built an empire somewhere that isn't nullsec, right? All of that influences how people feel about it and where they end up living. Of course, Goonswarm's culture is okay with this. We're all still living in Delve, right? But it affects the way people behave and how populated the space is, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, it's not just about whether or not there's ore to mine or whether or not a dreadnought can be built. It's the fact that,
it has to be worth doing.
The old content was bad, and CCP has kind of been replacing it with newer content over time. However, they have cut pretty deep into nullsec stuff, because a lot of that is that AFKable, non really engaging, like the worst kinds of PvE. And yet the real issue is that no alternative has been put in place.
I think if we were in a situation where what had happened was CCP had, say they do take out belts or whatever, or say they nerf infinite respawn on anomalies, for God's sake, that's a key part of the whole Rorqual problem, right? If they were to then introduce a set of new sites that were, of appropriate like size for a capital or a super capital to run, for example, and make those more engaging, we would not have a problem with that. That would be interesting. And you don't need to make those, someone in chat over here is saying, oh, he just wants the Reign of the Rorquals back. But that's not true, right? Content like that, your end game content, should not be that much better than the tier below it, right? A Rorqual is never supposed to have been however many times better than a barge. It only needs to be some small slice better than a barge, right? Your Titan ratting should not be producing 4 or 5 times the ISK, right? It should be producing somewhat more, right? Enough to make it worth the risk, but not enough to break your game, to break your progression curve, right? So yeah, I think Nullsec would absolutely be down with that type of content. I don't think there's a barrier to that. Of course, we don't want NPCs attacking us that we didn't think were going to be there, like a drifter where they're persecuting structures. But I think that was a sort of really specific situation that won't recur.
So what about things like the rogue analysis beacon? Is that a step in the right direction then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. No, the crab beacons are good. The mechanics, well, people have been trying to abuse those as hard as they can. That's always a trick, right? But I think they should be doing 10 different types of exactly that type of thing, right? And again, a new thing to figure out each time.
It sounds to me like we're actually in 100% agreement that what we're missing is a variety of things to do, not just the capability of accumulating power, right?
Right, yeah.
When people talk about scarcity, when people talk about the Reign of the Rorqual, we focus on resource extraction, resource availability, that's what, whatever. But it sounds to me like really we need interesting things and reason for people to be doing things. That what's really wrong here is that the value of doing things has been stripped away, and therefore there's no reason to do them. Therefore, there's this like listlessness kind of feel, this malaise. Is that pretty much nail it?
I have used the word malaise a number of times. And
nice.
So that's true for the half you're talking about. And the other half is the power curve being broken. The fact that too many people have reached the end game and there's no end game after it, right? There's nothing that comes after your Titan, right? There's no Tech 2 Dreadnought, which is a Titan killer, right? There's no next thing. And that's missing. Right, every game needs a progression curve.
Isn't that just kicking the can down the road, though? I mean, like, the real problem here is that it's a 20-year-old game, so there's people with 20 years of wealth, right? Do we just keep on building bigger and nastier things so that way there's people, like, the new people have further and further to have to catch up? Or, like, I don't necessarily like this out-of-control power creep idea either.
Sure, no, I agree that would be bad, right? Of course, the game I came from previously, there's power creep every 6 months. There's a new patch, you come back, all your gear is done, the epics you had before, they don't matter. Nobody wants that for Eve, right? But the power curve we did have should have lasted a good long time. Like I was saying earlier, I think people could have been building, if we had not had Rorquals in the middle, I think people would have been building out on that power curve till easily 2025 or 2030 before you would have seen multiple sustained 1,000 Titan fights.
Absolutely can agree with that.
But so that doesn't change the fact that if you want Eve to go beyond that, at some point you need to expand the curve. They added Titans and super carriers at some point and sort of really changed the power curve and how it worked with Dominion, right? Was when the modern super capital mechanics were introduced. That it's going to happen at some point. What you want to do is not screw it up like you did with Rorquals. And that's why I thought some of these, like the industry diversification stuff, right? You don't want it to be possible for any given group of players to sort of get through the power curve too quickly. Those mechanics were broken, right? But you have to have one. Otherwise, you do have malaise on the opposite end. All the people who already are finished with what they want to do, they don't have anything else motivating them. In World of Warcraft, this has a name. It's called the Thunder Fury effect. There was a a legendary in the first expansion of Vanilla World of Warcraft called Thunder Fury, and you had to get 2 very rare drops for it, one from one boss and one from another boss in the same dungeon. And often, and it was a great weapon for both your damage, but also for your tank. And so you would often give one of the bindings to the tank, and he'd wait months.
Mm-hmm.
He'd wait months to get the second binding, and you know what would happen then? He'd quit. Because he was done.
Yeah.
He was at the end of the power curve. This is the Thunder Fury effect. And EVE Online right now today is suffering, and has been for years, under a huge version of this, where a huge number of players don't have the next thing motivating them because they're at the end of that power curve. And there's nothing to take out the top of the power curve that does exist, right?
Right.
Titans are it, right? There are some counters, but it's, that structure of M2 Tech XFE was like a Rochambeau, right? It was the Titan kill count going up on each side. But a Tech 2 Dreadnought, that's a Titan killer if I've ever heard of one, right? And so when I saw Rattati with his chart of Tech 1, Tech 2, Tech 3 capitals and faction and all of this stuff that he published a year ago, or maybe it just leaked, I don't know, but I saw it and I thought to myself, holy crap, maybe this guy knows what he's talking about and has a vision that will last 20, 30, 40 years where the original one would not have. And then, like I said, they didn't do any of those other things I hoped for afterward.
Right.
And so here I am talking about it.
Fair enough. But given the fact that you come from that like pre-Citadel era, one of the things that I felt about this is that the real problem here is that there is a power curve, right? Like it used to be that you could have 100 Titans, you still wouldn't fucking drop them all at the same time because they wouldn't be valuable. They would just be extra like risk on the field. Titans were not able to apply to smaller things. You would use Titans where you used them, but there were other things that were more powerful under other conditions. However, it seems like we've transitioned to this idea that capitals are just better than subcapitals.
Yeah, I mean, we have never wanted that to be true. In practice, it has turned out to be, right? I think you might be underrating how good they've been at different points. There have been times in the metagame where it's there are counters, there are serious counters.
I'm overstating it to make the point.
A little bit, yeah. But I remember a couple of years where Pandemic Legion would have no more than 30 or 40 Titans on the field, and there was nothing we could do against one in our battleships, right? So it's troublesome. Essentially that's the power curve that does exist. There should be counters within that, right? You shouldn't just always be deploying. There's real escalation tactics, and I think the mechanics EVE does have for those of how escalations work aren't the worst, actually. They could be improved. There's a lot of things there about how that plays out, right? But that doesn't change the fact that there is an end at some point, and that way too many people got there too quickly, right? I'll quote Rattati a year ago when he came on the Meta Show and was talking to Mittani, said, well, it should not have been that easy. And we absolutely agree. It was too easy. It was too fast. We didn't want to run EVE to the end of its power curve that quickly, but here we are. And to be fair, PanFam got there first. We were catching up, right? So
yeah, I guess my point is that I would like to see somebody who gets Titans instead of thinking like, I've done it, I've now completed the power curve, instead being like, I now have access to all of the tools.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, I agree. I want to say you're right. Like, you are right. There's
I want you to say that
many
too.
things. Yeah. In practice, though, it seems like we're observing that I am also right. Right.
No, you are right now. But my point is that wouldn't the real solution be to go back more, like try to push more towards that other way rather than suggest T2 Titans? Wouldn't T2 Titans just exacerbate? I actually really like the idea of T2 Dreads with specialty purposes, but simply elevating the top end of the power curve just seems to reinforce the wrong strategy.
It can if you do it badly. Right, I think you don't want another thing where it's a few years, right? You want to be setting this up. If in fact you do it this way, there are many other potential ways to do it, right? But you should be doing one set of a new Tech 2 capital every couple of years, right? And have it last you a good long time, right? And the same thing we haven't talked about, faction, pirate. There's so many possibilities in power curve terms here, and again, doesn't need to be that big of a buff, right?
Well,
you know exactly how much people will pay for something that is 2% better in EVE Online, right?
Right, but they
So
did faction capital supers and capitals, but
they
they ended the
did a few,
project
yeah.
because it didn't end up actually adding anything to the design space.
I guess I mean that can be true to an extent, but I think it adds something to your power curve space, and this is a valuable part of the power curve is something that's not that much more powerful, but is shinier, right? And that it gives some people something to do, right? I know a guy right now who's building a Vanity Vanquisher, or thinks he is. I don't know if he'll succeed, right? But he thinks it's doable now all of a sudden. There was no way he was going to try that when that thing's price was up in the 900 billion or whatever,
Sure.
right? It just, so yeah. It is, it's complex. I don't think, at least not since Dominion, and that's really, I was never part of the sort of broken metagame of before Dominion. But really, ever since Dominion, this has been the power curve, right? Selene, ever since Selene said a Titan can doomsday a carrier, the future was set at that point, right? That's the game we've been playing for 12 years. I don't think we're going to get out of it at that point, or at least I don't see a way how. But that's not to say you're totally wrong. There should be serious interplay between these classes of ship, and to some extent there is, right? In M2 in particular, we played tactics very well, and we made sure to mulch all of the opposing enemy fighter bombers. Before launching any of our own, we had space superiority deployed and managed to lance their dreadnought fleet off the field before it did any damage. So there is a fair amount of that where it's not cut and dry by any means. But the big picture is still that a Titan fight looks like a Rochambeau and you're counting the score, right?
Right. So we are actually over time, but I'm okay with that. But I do want to at least give you like a 10-minute warning. I do have some other stuff to talk about, but if you have anything that you want to make sure to bring up or talk about first, now's a good opportunity if we've missed anything or you want to double down on anything.
I guess, I mean, I think I'll restate my big point, which is connected to what I was saying earlier about CCP making new stuff. I do not blame CCP as much as I think many goons do. I blame the player base more, right? I think frequently, even at the best of times, the player base of EVE is bitter and partisan, and they'll always push for crap that is not what they want, right? And my big example for that is a bunch of our enemies pushing for changes that ultimately won us the war, we feel like, right? We've got to get past this somehow. And always, or almost always, the answer to something you feel like is broken in EVE, something that's overpowered, something where you can't beat someone, is to not ask for that thing to be nerfed. It's to find some way that a different playstyle, possibly even 2 or 3 playstyles, can get a buff.
Right.
That you can compete with that thing, right? And that also engages the mechanics of CCP has tossed a new toy into the sandbox. So if there's one thing I can persuade people to do, it would be to look for that. Right? Don't look at Marauders being too powerful and say, let's nerf them into the ground. Right? Look for some way that CCP could change something and makes it easier to catch Marauder. Right? Or, you know, whatever it is. Well, there's so many examples.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I'm going to jump on that. Sorry for interrupting you, but like that's such a great point. Like, especially in PvP, the issue with meta balancing is that there are 2 ways of... the way that the meta works is that a tool has things that it's good against and things that it's bad against. And so there are things that it is the hard or soft counter for, the things that it hunts, and there are the things that it is that are soft or hard counters for it, the things that hunt it. Therefore, if something is not powerful enough, it is often a good idea, or sorry, if something is out of control, it is often a good idea to buff the hunter rather than nerf it. And I think that that's kind of the way that they're going with this now. Like, I feel like a lot of the things that they've mentioned, I agree with you, that the things that they've said sounds good. The things that they have done, I'm a bit sketchier on. But, like, for instance, this idea that dreads are the threat to Titans. That's great. Let's double down on that. You know, battleships are potentially a threat to dreads. Let's double down on that, right? Like, rather than tell people that they can't be in Titans or that Titans aren't good, we can just make it so that dreads are more effective against them, which increases the threat and increases the play and counterplay. I love that notion a lot.
And that, I mean, I think it can apply more generally, right? Go back to the big sort of thing you would not expect a goon candidate to say. I think a big fix they could have done to not make the Rorqual go the way it did was at the time when you switched to cracked moons introduce some totally different way of holding space for
Right.
its value that does not involve crabbing.
I do actually really like this idea of like having NPCs, almost like having like the sovereignty owners almost playing their own game of Stellaris, where they can like allocate resources to different places. Oh man, that'd be pretty cool.
I mean, the key idea here is separate from the NPC like stuff and what ultimately they do in game design. The key is a tension between two different ways of doing a thing. Right now, it's not just I can farm my space or it sits useless. It's I can choose to farm my space or I can do something different where it's not getting farmed. And now there are these two different ways of running your space that are in tension. Right, and you have to decide how you're using it. That's a great mechanic, right? A similar thing with the ESS we were chatting about a few days back. God, I can't remember who it was, but realize that the tension is what's missing with the ESS, the reserve bank in particular, right? What CCP has done is it created a system where you have these keys, and I, as the SOV holder, I want the keys because I want my money, right? That's how I get my money is with the keys. But everybody else also wants my keys because they also want my money, right? So the upshot is that everybody wants the keys. Well, where are the keys? Well, they're in low-sec sites. So what CCP has done economically is created a situation where everybody is motivated to run as many low-sec PvE sites as possible. But CCP didn't want that. CCP wanted us to want our money, and it wanted other people to steal our money, and it wanted both of us to fight over it, right? And that's happening. But we're not motivated to do that. We're motivated to just get as many keys as possible, right? So these sort of things happen almost by accident. This is a super well understood economic principle actually called Baumel's cost disease. And this is why the price of the reserve bank keys is very close to their value that they can extract, right? Is because ultimately all the value flows to the person who farmed the key, right? What you want to do is establish a system that has tension, right? Now, to do that, you're going to piss everybody off, right? The reason you're going to piss everybody off is you want to say, okay, the SOV holder is just going to get their money at some point. Maybe it takes time. It takes a week of not being molested. Say the reserve bank pays out 20% or whatever after a week of not being hit, right? Everyone who's not a big block person is going to hate this idea, right? Because they're saying, oh, you're just giving away trillions to blocks, right? What you do on the other side is you say a key is now not worth flat value. Instead, the key is also worth 20% of the reserve bank's current contents.
Right.
But it also, in addition to that, you don't want the SOV holder going after the key here, right? I'm supposed to sit on it and defend it. You say now that key, it doesn't just steal 20%, it also deletes 30% of the bank's value, right? So if I use a key, I'm essentially burning the fields.
So you're saying that waste is the solution to this?
Well, the waste in this particular mechanic, waste is what would prevent me, the SOV holder, from wanting the same thing as the robber does, which is the current situation, right? Well, but like I said, both sides hate this. I would sort of hate this because it means that one successful keyjack takes 50% of my bank. Other players, non-block players, hate this because when I say something like this to them, I'll show you in one of the Discords, someone said, oh, you're proposing giving away trillions to the block, blah, 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 right? But with both of them together, there's tension. Now it's a race to who can do which first, right? Can I defend my stuff long enough to get the money? Or is someone going to pick up a key that only costs them a couple billion, but actually they're going to go look for the one system in Dell that has 90 billion and try and steal as much as they can, right?
Right.
That's the sort of stuff that's missing is the tension between different mechanics.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't necessarily agree with your core assumption there. I always interpreted that design to be about everything that CCP has done when it comes to these sorts of changes has been to facilitate a trade-based economy. So the idea is that the people that farm the keys and the people that use the keys aren't necessarily the same people. That the intent is actually that one group of people or one, like some people farm it and then sell it to the people who then use it. And to that end, I think that that's kind of what it did. However, that being said, I think that your idea is particularly interesting and probably a much more interesting way of kind of dealing with that situation.
it would have upped I mean, they wanted this, right? They had a whole blog about how it was going to be this huge, like, everyone was going to go racing for the keys, and that just didn't happen because they're only worth so much. There are only so many of them. The sites are hard, and everyone wants the keys, right? If you up the ante on both sides so that there's real risk on both sides, suddenly you have a mechanic where there's tension, and and then you would see what you're talking about with the economy, right? If the keys have a variable value, not all of the value can flow to the key seller. They'll stabilize around some price that's actually more around the effort involved to make them, right? And you should probably introduce a much more common key drop at a lower percentage if you did something like this.
Right.
And then you really would have that trade effect, right? Right now, the Baumol's cost disease I was talking about is just dominating the market, and it's totally useless. So,
yeah. Reserve Bank is such a weird situation. I do want to kind of go back a little bit to that like predator versus prey sort of situation, because there is a really good example that I wanted to bring up of where it is bad right now. Marauders. A lot of people are talking about nerfing Marauders.
Yeah.
The problem is that CCP introduced an Achilles heel to Marauders, which is that they can be jammed. The problem with that is that when you jam a ship, you can lock back the ship that can be jammed. And most jamming ships survive by being really far away from their opponent rather than having a good tank or anything like that. And it turns out Marauders are particularly good at killing things that are really far away. Which makes it so that the Marauder is really good at killing the thing that's supposed to counter them. That is an example of where you could actually make a ship that could jam the Marauder, that the Marauder could not then slough off as easily. And that could potentially be a better solution than just nerfing Marauders further.
Do remote sensor dampeners and tracking disruptors do anything these days?
Nope, they're immune.
Okay. Oh, really? Yep. Oh, the Bastion thing, yeah, of course.
Bastion makes them immune to everything besides newts and jams.
This is how out of date I am.
And newts, meaning that they have to be close by, which the Marauder can then either use their own newts or just raffle stomp. Or the everything from the Scorpion to the Kitsune usually wants to be pretty far away.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to be close to anything in a ship with no effective mid slots.
Right. And my Paladin has a 110 kilometer optimal. So what are you going to do?
Yeah,
it has 50% resistance. My bad. It's not immune. It's a 50% resistance. That's correct. They could actually theoretically do that, but it also has diminishing returns on use of it. So, yeah, my point is that that's a good example of where the real problem here is that the predator the hunter doesn't have the skill set it takes to actually do the hunting.
Right, and that's a great case for mechanical changes where you go to compete and you find out you can't. And you've tried everything, then that's exactly where the buff comes in, right? And that's appropriate. But what we should not just be doing is going and saying, Marauders are too good, nerf them. No.
Because then you come up with all kinds of crazy solutions and end up like making it so that either you've lost the point of why people want the Marauders in the first place. Like actually the change that they made when they buffed Marauders and then they nerfed them again to bring them back in line. But the way they nerfed them was making them vulnerable to jams. And I really liked that because it didn't take away the thing that they added to make them special. It just added in a new risk. The problem is that I just don't think it quite worked the way it needed to.
Yeah, true.
So cool. Outstanding. Right. Well, it's been a fantastic talk with you. I kind of want you to come on anytime you want to chat about something, just hit me up and I will find time to have you on the show.
We'll see. I love getting the word out. I'm sure there will be a couple PR campaigns I need to prosecute this year. We'll see how it goes. Thanks for having me. This has been a blast.
I do have, of course, the most important question of the interview.
All right.
Cat ears, yes or no?
Yeah, actually, my cats are named Panther, Cheetah, and Jenkins. So there's 2 out of 3 Eve names. They're all feral. They live in the backyard. We live in the desert, so we rescued 2 of them as kittens. So I'm going to have to say yes on cat ears. I'm well on my way to crazy cat lord status.
Nice. All right. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. Like real talk, you absolutely didn't have to come here in order to probably get elected. Therefore, it is an incredibly to your credit for doing so. And I've had a wonderful chat and I hope that you have too.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks.
And thank you all for watching. If you're checking this out on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe before you go. Make sure to ask any questions that you want for him in the comments down below or in his forum post, which is linked in the doobly-doo down below. Yeah, best of luck to you on your CSM election. And I will be keeping a very close eye on you once you get on the CSM. I think that
Let us hope.
I'm very... With this being the head of the Imperium candidate docket, I feel pretty hopeful about this CSM.
I hope so. Please exercise your freedom of choice and vote exactly as the state tells you. That's my platform.
I will ask you this though: of all of the people not on the Imperium ballot, who would you personally like to see elected?
I mean, so I gotta say, I selected the 4 cute puppies that round out our ballot myself after interviewing them. Right, so I got it like Jinxtakare, Alaska, Ithaca Hawk, and Kale Kataru are the 4 non-Imperium people we put on our ballot. Right, yeah, I thought so as well. Thank you. That was what I spent some of my time doing in the past week. So I endorse all 4 of those guys. I'd love to see any of them on the CSM, and that in fact was our strategy. Right, we thought it's most likely that what we achieve is that we could put one of them over the top, exactly like happened with Suetonia last year by a tiny fraction of votes, right? And so I looked at all of them, and I thought those were interesting. I'm going to be interested to see what else happens. I'm not sure I have a name, but if he does manage to get on, I'm really interested to see how Haiwanto behaves on the CSM. I think that'll be interesting, right? We built a whole super capital fleet for Snuffed while I was sort of AFK. So that's an interesting historical element that I missed.
I still kind of am mad at you for that, by the way.
It wasn't me.
I understand. I mean, you as in the collective you.
I know, yeah. The imperial us. Yep.
Yeah. Black Rice has never been the same.
It's true.
All right. Well, yeah. On that note, thank you guys. Thank you once again. I have been on behalf of Jesus. How do I finish this thing? On behalf of Kazanir and myself, Ashrothi, the voice of New Eden. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, we'll see you in space.
Thanks, everybody.